you very much for coming to our study group session. We are going to be learning all about the joys of single sign-on with multiple Salesforce orgs. I'm excited. Woo! So without further ado, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors. All three of you are fantastic sponsors and have given us a lot of assistance and support and enabled us to do a few things we didn't think were possible a year ago. So thank you very much for your support. And if any of you would like to join the club and look at sponsoring us, we're always happy to have those conversations. So my name is Gemma. If you don't know me, I'm the noisy one and the noisy, loud English girl. With a bawdy sense of humour and a little bit on the cheeky side, but I do mean well. I founded Ladies Be Architects 2 years ago when I was studying alone and didn't really want to do it on my own anymore, and was fortunate enough to meet some fantastic women to begin leading in this space to help all of you become more senior delivery leaders. I'll hand over to Susannah.
Yeah. Thanks, Gemma. So my name is Susannah. I am a technical architect at Odaseva in my day job, but I am also, or I'm a co-lead of Ladies Be Architects with Gemma and Charlie, whose birthday it is today. So Happy birthday, Charlie. She's not here with us, but yeah, definitely want to recognize her. I've been involved with LBA for, I don't know, like a year and a half or so, doing a fair amount of conference speaking and some of these study sessions as well. So I love being a part of spreading architect knowledge to anyone who is interested in learning more.
Absolutely. So, Susannah, your turn still.
Yeah. So what are we doing today? We are talking about multi-org and how it relates to identity and access. But first, we want to make sure that we welcome any new folks, maybe people who aren't familiar with what Ladies Be Architects is. So we'll do a little bit of an overview very quickly. We'll celebrate our champions. So we like to celebrate anyone who's gotten one of the architect certifications that's on the Salesforce Architect Pyramid. So we will do a shout out to any of you. And if we missed any of you, this is a manual process right now. So if we missed any of you, please feel free to shout out, let us know. And please, yes, don't take it personally. If we happen to miss you off the list, we'll celebrate you in our next meeting. And following that, we'll go into all the technical content that you guys are here for. So who are we for people who maybe aren't so familiar? Gemma, as she mentioned, is the founder of this great community group. We aren't an official Salesforce community group, but what we are is three friends with a shared vision of helping women and men become as technical as they want to be. And the three of us, so me, Charlie, and Gemma are all mums or doggy moms of some sort. We all have a fair amount of certifications, and we all have a long-term goal of pursuing the certified technical architect. Charlie and Gemma have already taken the exam, and I hope to do it sometime in the not so distant future. And what else? Yes, meanwhile in Australia. So Gemma, Charlie, and I have been collaborating for the last 2 years, but in the past year, we had a really, really exciting development in the growth of our organization, which is the establishment of our ambassador program. So for the last year, we've had the wonderful company and support of three amazing women in Australia. Vicky Jeffrey's on the call right now. It's 6 a.m. where she is, but she is here with us. So thank you for joining, Vicky. And then also Emily and Adrian are also our wonderful ambassadors as well. So I think that's where we switch off, Gemma. Let's see.
Lovely, thank you. So so we actually are quite well prepared this time, so we're not doing too bad, are we? And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is just by congratulating all of you who have achieved architect certifications in February and March. As Susannah said, we welcome everybody from all identities and backgrounds. to participate with us. We're not a club, you can't join per se, but you can take part. Because anybody who is not a man, effectively, in this world, tends to be quite underrepresented in a technical leadership space. So we do pay particular attention to celebrating the achievements of the ladies out there. So I'm just going to call out, as Susannah said, it's a really manual process. So we don't know if you've passed an exam unless you tweet out and mention us, or you put it on LinkedIn and mention us. And then it's a case of one of us grabbing our phone and then logging it in the Salesforce app that we use. So if we have missed you, we apologize, but please make sure that if in future, if you pass any exams, just make sure you tag us so that we can see you. So congratulations, we want to say congratulations to Jamie Ann, who has passed Platform App Builder since we last met. Congratulations. We actually track attainment of exams that are part of the architect program as well, just to be really specific. PD1, we've got four magnificent women who have passed Platform Developer 1 lately, so that's a shout out to Barb, Melissa, Janet, and Robin. Congratulations to all of you.
Sorry.
Okay. Another one for Lynn Grandy down in Florida, who has passed Integration Architecture. Congratulations.
It's a tough one.
It's a horrible one. And to Lene, who we've seen her face on our slides quite a lot lately. She's really been great. Can you go on mute, please? She's worked quite hard on her architect certifications lately. So congratulations to Lene, who recently passed development lifecycle. Okay. Rebecca and Janet, congratulations to you. You passed data architecture and management. And who's next? Sharing and visibility. This is a big one this time. So Hermia, fantastic Shakespearean name. I love it. Congratulations to Radhika, who is in the UK. Carol Marotti. Janet has passed sharing and visibility as well. And to Vicky, who's on the call. Well done, hun. Well done. Congratulations on sharing and visibility. And of course, what that often means is those of you who have passed certain certifications, will know that once you get to a certain level, once you've completed one side of the architect pyramid, you are awarded the application or system architect exams. So we have 5 new application architects: Rebecca, Janet, Sheetal, Radhika, and Jennifer. Congratulations to all of you.
Nice.
So we like to reward you as well. We don't like you to just have a certification. So if you want to receive a gift voucher that you can use in our swag store on Redbubble, please make sure that you send us your address using the bit.ly link. Sorry, actually, we don't need your address. We need your email address. Let me change that. And then I will spend the afternoon doing some shopping on Redbubble and get you a gift voucher that you can go and go and use to buy some Ladies Be Architects swag. Just make sure that when it arrives, take a photo of yourself with it and mention us on Twitter so that we can share in the joy of your certification pass. And please make sure that if you've passed a certification, tell us about it so that we can track it. Okay, let's get on then. So Susannah, over to you.
Absolutely. So this morning, afternoon, evening, we're going to be talking about the Identity and Access Management Designer exam. And this is one of the architect certifications that a lot of people leave for last. It's one of the more challenging certifications, especially for folks like me and probably a lot of you on the phone who maybe don't have a traditional computer science or technical background, but it definitely is achievable. And we're really excited to talk about maybe a more little known topic today with you. But to make sure we're all on the same page, first, I know this is a lot of text, maybe why it's one of the most daunting exams, but there's lots of different concepts on the Identity and Access Management Designer exam. And you can see them here. You can also see them on the exam guide, which we will share out with you in the slides. I also saw a question in the comments about if this session will be recorded, and it is being recorded, and we will share it out on our YouTube channel and also on the Ladies Be Architects blog. So don't worry about that. So this is a lot of content. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I think the takeaways here is that the top three on the left-hand side of the screen are around identity management concepts. So understanding what the different levers exist in Salesforce that have to do with identity, what some of the common terms and just IT sort of lingo around identity is really important to understand. Also how to integrate with third-party identity applications. So whether you're doing Salesforce to Salesforce multi-org, like we're going to be talking about today, and I don't mean Salesforce to Salesforce the tool, we'll talk about that later as well, or whether you're making sure that you understand how to set up Salesforce as an identity provider or as a service provider. We're going to talk about that too in the context of a multi-org implementation. But you won't see multi-org on this exam guide. And that's why I actually had, Gemma and I had a conversation earlier this week about this.
Is it even a identity and access management topic? And we both agreed that actually it is. And we want to explain to you why this is. Oh, hello, Prudvi. We've got someone joining. And in order to explain why it is, it means we have to explain some of the features of Salesforce identity. And the reason that we talk about Salesforce identity and in the context of things like single sign-on or connected apps is it's all actually focused around preventing malicious attacks and third-party access to your Salesforce org that you wouldn't want people to have. And of course, the main features of single sign-on is the fact that you can log into various different environments without having to remember a password because the two systems operate by token exchange. So, and when we looked at the single to multi-org model, it's still the key concepts around that are still relatable to single sign-on. Obviously, somebody, no matter how your organization is structured and laid out and distributed around the world, there's still going to be someone at the top who needs to see everything that's in everybody's org. So they're going to need to seamless. They don't want to be logging into, say, 6 different Salesforce orgs to do that. So single sign-on is a key feature of that, as well as centralized user account management. Imagine if you've got 5 different Salesforce orgs and you have, say, 3 or 4 chief ops officers that need to log into, say, 2 or 3 of them, then really, you're going to have 2 or 3 different logins for that individual. So centralizing that user account management really helps to keep control over the user provisioning element, and also keep control over the apps that they use from a security perspective and from an IT infrastructure perspective as well. So we talked about in terms of identity, single sign-on, connected apps, centralized user account management, user provisioning, but also there are other elements that play a key role here. One is Identity Connect, which is how you would connect Salesforce to Active Directory if you weren't using any other third-party identity providers. But then we also have the concepts of My Domain, social sign-on using OpenID, and 2-factor authentication for that high assurance security model.
Mm-hmm. And this one should actually be blue. I'm realizing now looking at this. So that's this one we are going to talk about because this becomes important for multi-org, My Domain. Yeah. And then just one other note, Gemma, just to sort of chime in, all of these, like if you look at the link at the bottom of the slide, this is what Salesforce defines as their different identity features. And for people learning about identity for the first time, it can become a little bit confusing because there is a lot of blur between what you think about as just Salesforce, the Salesforce platform, things like the app launcher, which is in Lightning Experience, whether or not you're using single sign-on or not. That is also an identity feature, and we'll show you how that can be used for identity specific stuff later on.
And my domain's fundamental because it also creates a unique identifier for your individual Salesforce org. And you'll notice if you ever want to work with Lightning components, you will need my domain enabled. So I've now got to the point when I'm working with clients, I just enable it. It's one of the first things that I do by default. Before I've even set up the role hierarchy, I'm setting up my domain because you never know when you might need it.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we have to do when we are deciding, let's say you got a new Salesforce customer or a new instance, and you have to decide, or you're talking to Salesforce, you're buying Salesforce brand new, and you have to make a decision about what your strategy is going to be. And I had this happen about 2 weeks ago, actually, but it wasn't with Salesforce. It was with Social Studio, whereby there were two separate entities that were effectively departments of the same entity, and they had joined the procurement process expecting to have two separate instances, one for one and one for the other. And we had to explain why that was a different architecture, and actually take a look at their needs and make a decision about how to position that org strategy. If any of you are planning to do the review board, this is also an absolutely fundamental way of deciding your strategy. I failed my CTA review board because I selected the wrong strategy for my org. So it's kind of ironic that I'm still here talking about this now. But effectively, there are some elements that you need to think about, and there are 4 approaches to this. When you are deciding, think about how unified you want your business processes to be, and how standardized you want them to be as well. Obviously, if you're looking at, let's take a regional example, every country has different laws around data protection and around regulatory reporting that has to take place, especially in financial services settings and public sector settings. So when we decide on this, we have to say, okay, is the business process integration level high or low? And what kind of level is the business process standardization needing to be? Now, if you've got a high level of business process integration, where you have unique business units that need to know what's going on in other business units, and you have to create a standard unified way to access a big repository of data that's shared across everywhere, then you might look at multi-org, but also think about ways to connect it together, and that's the coordination approach. Most of us will operate in the top right-hand corner around the unification side because of all the benefits, right? All the benefits that Salesforce tells us about this shared view, single view of customer 360, get everybody's buy-in, single view of the account and all the relationships. 95% of the time, in my 12 years of delivering Salesforce, I've seen the unification approach used, where actually customers are trying to solve a challenge that's been caused by diversification, where there is no single view of customer, where there is no single set of standards, and they want to move to a more unified model. So the key capability there is that, and you'll see this in enterprise, and actually I think you'll see it right the way across all the horizontals, that if they're not highly regulated, where you have one business unit with a single set of standards, you have one data set that everybody needs access to, and you want everyone to work the same way, then you'll use single org. Other cases where you might use multi-org is if you've got independent but similar business units. So conglomerates might be a good example of that, where you have several different companies where they don't need to necessarily report at the top level. There are ways that you can using tools like Tableau and so on. But even though those business units are similar, they are still independent. And you can still provide the standard infrastructure, but then you need to see that data completely compartmentalized. I had a customer a few years ago which had several wineries. They were part of the same group, but they had different wineries, and because they all make wine, of course they all compete with one another. So they needed to have different orgs, one for each winery, so that the experience could be different and they could compete. So that was another example of when to use that replication, because you know, same business. In terms of diversification, what these are for, you would use multi-org for this approach, where you have different customers, different expertise, completely independent units. I had a global consultancy that was doing this. They had one consultancy that did Salesforce work. They had another one that did SAP work. They had another one that did public sector. They had another one that was an agency. So they needed to have a separate org. And what we ended up having was one separate org for each of those areas, but then one org sitting in the middle, which had Financial Force ERP, and all of their data was flowing into the Financial Force org for the management accounting, and that was spread across all the different business units. So that's another level of architecture there. So when you're faced with a scenario, think about how diverse the environment needs to be. Other things to consider are volumes. That got me in the backside when I was at the CTA board, because, you know, 72 million customers, one org. Yeah, I don't think so, Gemma. So, but, you know, these are all things that you should consider as well.
And I just add, I think the different customers on the diversification quadrant is really key. That's like, if you see there aren't shared customer base, that's like one of the, you know, ding, ding, ding. Okay, they don't share customers. Maybe that goes into the strategy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's worth just thinking. This is whether you need the experience really to make those key decisions.
And one more point, just going back to, sorry, I know we want to get into the good identity and access stuff, but this quadrant is supposed to be where your customer or where you want to be. It's not where you are today. So I think that's an important call out too. Like, even if you're in the diversification today, but your goal is to go to unification, you would want to design for where you want to be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go back, let's ground ourselves again in identity and access. So we talked about why you might need multi-org based on your business process. But once you decide and land on, yes, I need multi-org for whatever reason, how are you actually going to do it? These are the three main considerations from a technical perspective that we want to talk with you today about. So how are the users going to authenticate? How are they going to log into the 6 different orgs that you're architecting? How are they then going to navigate from org to org? Are they going to, and there's lots of nuance around that, right? Do they need to navigate? Are they going to be doing it at the beginning of their day? Is there a business process where halfway they have to hop out and go to a separate org? And if that's the case, how do you make it easier for them? And then the final thing is what about data, right? We're talking about identity and access, but data, exchanging data in Salesforce and across Salesforce orgs requires authentication and access too. So what data needs to be kept in sync, if any, and what tools are you going to do to make that happen? What tools are you going to use to make that happen? So let's tackle the first question first. How will users authenticate? And to take a step back for anyone maybe new to all this terminology, authenticate essentially is proving that you are who you say you are. So usually the most simplest form when you authenticate, it's entering your username and password and saying, yes, I should have access to this particular data or application. So how are users going to authenticate? If we have multi-org and we have 6 different sets of Salesforce orgs that a single user needs to share, we probably don't want to have them having 6 different usernames and passwords for a number of reasons. One is it's just crappy UX, right? A user is not going to be having a good experience with your design, with Salesforce in general, if they have to remember 6 different passwords and usernames to get their job done. And it's also going to become a headache for your support org, for your admin costs, right? If you have one Salesforce admin for your 6 orgs and they're getting 6 times as many password requests, that's not great from both a cost and time perspective. And then also from a security perspective, like Gemma spoke about, having 6 times the amount of passwords and having those passwords stored in 6 different spots doesn't add to definitely does not increase your security. So the solution to all of this is leveraging one of those identity tools called single sign-on. And with single sign-on, we'll be able to avoid those unfortunate situations that we mentioned and instead see increased security and increased adoption and reduced administrative costs. So what does this actually look like? How do we implement single sign-on? And how does it look, or what does it look like in a multi-org scenario? So oftentimes when you're architecting a single sign-on solution for multi-orgs, you'll see what's referred to as a hub and spoke model. So that's on the right side of the screen. And to understand this, this graphic, especially if you're new to identity and access, we just want to go over a few key terms that we're going to be using a lot for the next 30 minutes. One of them is the term SAML. So SAML is short for Security Assertion Markup Language. And we use SAML, so you can see that there's a SAML sign back and forth between these boxes. We use SAML to authenticate between applications. So essentially to say, if I'm coming from one Salesforce org, I should be allowed to get in this other Salesforce org. And SAML is an XML-based protocol. So it's written in XML. We'll look at some XML later. But it's used at its core to authenticate between these two web apps. Another term that you'll see all over these slides is IDP. So the IDP is in the middle here. It's the hub. And IDP stands for Identity Provider. So an identity provider can be a Salesforce org, and in our scenario, it is going to be a Salesforce org. And the identity provider is in charge of making sure that the users that are asking for specific resources should have them, that they that trust should be established, and that they are using credentials that are recognized by this identity provider. Identity provider can be something like Salesforce. It also could be something like Okta. Like if you're used to seeing the Okta application that allows you to authenticate into all your different apps that you use at work. The other, oh, sorry, Gemma?
Sorry, Susannah, I just want to add a point about this as well, because it can be quite easy to consider an identity provider being the same thing as an identity store. And what you sometimes see is identities of your individual users are not necessarily held in Salesforce or not necessarily held in Okta. They can be stored in a centralized database like an LDAP store. Or they can be held in Active Directory, which then talks to an identity provider. And effectively, it's the identity provider is actually, Jessica, I'll answer your question in just a moment about that one. An identity provider is what all the other servers have to talk to find out whether this person is authorized and is allowed to access the resources from the service provider. But the identity provider's job is to check the store to see that that person is in the database. And in order to do that, they have to be able to identify them as well. Just to answer the question that came through the chat from Jessica, she asked, would an IDP be Google Authenticator? Google Authenticator is an example of two-factor authentication, and it's used in high assurance security models, where you have to make sure where you want to add an additional layer of security to make sure that the person who's logging in is actually present at the time that they need to log in.
Absolutely. The Google Authenticator is like an alternative for using text to your mobile device or an email to your email address as that second layer of security. Good questions and good call out. Yes, IDP is not necessarily is not the same thing as identity store or key store. So going on in this diagram, so we talked about identity provider, and Gemma spoke a little bit already about service provider. So in this multi-org scenario that we're talking about, the identity provider would be one Salesforce org that is the one that will tell these other orgs, yes, you should let this user in. They have the proper proper authorization to log into those orgs.
She said. Yeah, sorry. So I was thinking this is the one that also says this is definitely Susannah who's trying to log in.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. And also that it also makes sure that this org itself, the service provider, is a trusted Salesforce org. That if I try to log into Gemma's Salesforce org in London, that I shouldn't, all of this infrastructure is in place to make sure that I just can't willy-nilly try and log into any other Salesforce org that is not trusted already by my hub or my IDP. So service provider would be those other orgs in the multi-org scenario. Federation ID. So we talked about proving who you are and proving that you are who you say you are. The federation ID is going to be that unique user identifier that connects my user account in this hub to my user in org 2 or org 3 or org 25, whatever it might be. And we'll look at where that's stored in the user record. And then finally, SAML assertion. So when we're going to talk about SAML assertions a lot. Essentially, when you initiate a login, whether you initiate over here and say, hey, I want to log into this particular link over in org 2, or whether you log into the IDP first into your Salesforce org that has an app launcher to all your different other Salesforce orgs, whether you're doing that or whichever way you're doing it, there's going to be what's called a SAML assertion that is exchanged. And that assertion contains XML elements in a SAML token that contain information about the user. So that contain things like that federation ID or other attributes that you configure so that you can prove that Susannah is who she says she is when she tries to log into org 2. Anything else to add on this sort of graphic slide, Gemma?
No, I think you covered it. Sorry for the interruption.
No, it's good. So let's take a look at how do we implement that. That's great theory, hub and spoke, great. But how do I actually do this in Salesforce? It's complicated, but not as complicated as you might think. There are 4 main steps to do this. And there's a good resource that we will share. We should put it in the resources on the end of the slide deck that walks you through in a scenario how to set this up yourself. That's what I did in the 2 orgs that I'll be referencing today. But it's definitely something that you can set up for yourself and play around with. The 4 high-level steps, though, are creating a federation ID. So we talked about that unique attribute that's on the user that connects or is a reference for the users across multiple orgs. You also need to set up in your IDP certain settings. And we'll look at what those settings are and why it's important. You also need to do some other settings in your service provider orgs so that the 2 orgs know about each other and they know that they can trust each other. And then finally, if you've ever done any work with single sign-on, especially with SAML, you will know that it very rarely works the first time you set it up. There's always some weird, funky nuance about the XML SAML assertion or about the settings in Salesforce. So testing and knowing how to troubleshoot it is really important in implementing this as well. So the first step that we talked about is creating that federation ID. And there is a standard field on the user record that is used for this. You should definitely use that field because it's hooked up to a lot of the point-and-click configuration that you use with single sign-on. And this federation ID, in my example, I typed in an attribute. Oftentimes, this attribute will be stored, like Gemma was referencing, maybe in a separate store, something like Active Directory or in an LDAP. But federation ID is that, again, that unique attribute that it's going to be unique to a user in this particular hub org, because you want to make sure that if I'm trying to log in, I'm connecting to the right user record. But it will be the same across all of the spoke orgs, because you want to be sure that you're connecting to that right user. Yes, that's all on federation ID. And so once you have your federation ID, that's sort of the easy step. You set it up in your hub org and you add it to your user record. And then we have to do it's all point and click configuration, but it does take a little bit of getting used to where all these settings are. So there's 2 things that you need to do, and chime in, Gemma, if I'm missing anything, but there's 2 primary things that you need to do in your IDP org or in your hub central org. And those 2 things are, 1, setting up, enabling your org to be an identity provider. So there's a little toggle or a checkbox, and once you select that, then all of these additional settings will be available to you. And the first thing that you need to do is to generate a certificate. And this certificate is going to be used in both this IDP org and also in your SP orgs, so that, again, the orgs know that they can trust each other.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you need to download it and keep it safe.
Absolutely, yes. You need to download it. You do need to keep it safe. It is very, it is used for this trust. So, right, it is important to keep it safe, to upload it. What we're going to see in the next step is we upload it into the service provider org. What else do we need to do? We also need to manage, create a connected app. So we set up the identity provider. And if you're looking at older documentation, you'll sometimes see it referred to as, so you set up your identity provider and then you set up your service provider. There used to be a section to do that, but now that's all been shifted over to connected apps. So each and every one of your spokes in that nice diagram we looked at is going to be its very own connected app.
Correct. Absolutely. And then you'll need to enable SAML for that as well. So
yes,
make sure you match it up as SAML. It's fairly similar. Those of you, if you've ever hooked up G Suite to Salesforce for single sign-on, in G Suite you would download the client key and secret, and you put that in as an auth provider in Salesforce. This is kind of the same thing, but you're doing it with SAML, and you're doing it with other Salesforce orgs. So this is how Salesforce will talk to each other over the air, if you like.
Yeah, the SAML callout's a good one, and I was just going to pull up in my. So this is the org where I actually implemented it. You can see all my random things, but if I look at my connected app that we're working with, I can view. I always forget if it's viewer managed. That's my Achilles heel. But if I look here, so I can see, this was from the screenshot, but what you'll see, and it is in managed.
Yeah, but
never go to the first place.
There for you, Susannah, as well, because you had a start URL there, and that's basically that tells you that once you've actually logged into that app, where does your experience in that app start? Which page do you start on?
Exactly. And then Gemma was mentioning the SAML, making sure that your connected app is enabled for SAML. So there's a little checkbox, and then once you check it, you'll see all these additional links that are generated. And these links are how you can test, and you actually leverage these links sometimes if you're doing maybe something a little fancy with some custom code. But this is how you would leverage, and we'll go into this in a little bit, an IDP-initiated login. So all of this is halfway pre-wired in the Salesforce platform. It's really, really powerful, this idea of connected app and identity provider enablement. And it allows you to connect Salesforce to Salesforce, but also, as Gemma was saying, Salesforce to other external applications too. So
just note as well, on your entity ID there, you'll notice that this is your spoke connected app, right?
Yep.
The thing I find confusing sometimes is trying to remember exactly what I'm looking at. So if you can, obviously, if you're hooking this up to Trailhead Playground, you're going to get cunning badgers and resourceful goats. But if you're testing this out with DevOrgs, you can always use my domain and set it up as my spoke 1, my spoke 2. Just labeling things carefully is going to be an easier way for you to remember your way around. But the entity ID there is just your my domain URL for that org, which is why my domain is so important, because it's a unique identifier.
Exactly. And I'm going to speed up my presentation a little bit, because we could have done like 2 hours on this, I'm realizing.
Oh, no, tell me about it. We could do a live
so the third step, so we talked about the IDP. The third step is in your service provider org. So that second org that we looked at in the entity ID field. There's also sort of a complementary setting that you need to do. So you type in single sign-on, and there's a whole section for single sign-on settings. And this is where you would tell your service provider about the IDP. So I'm referencing my domain here in the issuer from my IDP org. And I am uploading the cert that was downloaded from my IDP in that step 1. And that's how you're sort of knitting these two orgs together. And you'll also see that at the very bottom, there's these endpoints, endpoints that are generated. And this is how we go about testing in our fourth step. So this endpoint that is generated, this is how I can go after I log out of both my orgs. I can go and access this particular login URL. This is a login to an SP-initiated login to my service provider org. Mouthful. Once I click on that, it's going to try to run my entire SP flow, and we'll look at that flow in a second. But oftentimes, as I mentioned, you're going to see some errors. So I generated these errors in the success today. Down here in my identity provider log, which I can see in my IDP org, I can see the fact that I had 3 failed attempts. I tried to go in with SP-initiated SAML, with IDP-initiated SAML, SP again, and then I finally realized what my error was, and I was able to log in successfully. There's also, again, on the flip side, this is in the IDP org where you'll see identity provider event log, or you'll see it in both places, but it'll only be useful if you can see it in both places in the IDP. But you'll also see a section in the SAML single sign-on settings for SAML assertion validator. And that will give you information if you see an error that says you have a bad, your assertion is bad, and there's lots of crazy error messages that you'll see. You can paste in that big honkin' SAML assertion XML chunk and get some human readable information back.
Okay, great. So, yeah, great job, actually. Great job. This is actually horrible material to have to learn. And you absolutely championed your way through that one. So when we talk about IDP initiated and SP initiated, we'll go into more detail in just a moment. But what we want you to try and remember is this diagram is showing you the steps for what you should do and when, and how they are in a hub and spoke model. So we have one IDP org, which is where Susannah's details are stored. It is the master org, where we've enabled my domain, where we have created and downloaded a self-signed certificate from that org. That certificate is something that we will then upload into other orgs, because as other orgs try to access information in the IDP org, that certificate needs to be appended to the end of the request to prove that it's actually come from a trusted Salesforce org and a trusted source, and should therefore allow access to the information. Okay, so Susannah talked us through the setup process for that, and then if you look at what we were doing in the other org, we enable the my domain again, but then we add the issuer, which is the idp.mine.salesforce.com under the single sign-on settings. Then we upload the certificate, which is the same certificate we downloaded from the IDP org, the master org. And then we start to add fields and issuer URLs to it. If you imagine you're setting up an integration between two systems and you're sending packets of information between the two, it's exactly the same concept, only this is the first part of the message, which is the fact that you can log in the first place in order to add or read the information that you need. So moving on to the next part. Question 1 that we had was, do I really need to set up users by hand in each org? And we're saying, no, you don't have to do that either. You can enable something called just-in-time provisioning in your IDP org, so that let's say Susannah is logged into her IDP org and she clicks on an app from her app launcher that is actually an app from a different org. It's a connected app. What we can actually tell the IDP org to do and the SP org to do, so the org that hosts the app that she needs, is actually to automatically create Susannah as a user in the other org, if it's the first time she's ever accessed that piece of information. And what we want you to remember is that when you do that, you can either use the standard user provisioning type, or you can create an Apex handler. An Apex handler will effectively tell the other org what kind of profile Susannah should have, what should be her role, which is really important if you've got security and sharing and visibility needs for the other org as well. But we just want you to remember that a SAML assertion, an assertion is the message that comes back to say, yes, it's okay for this person to access it, or no, it's not. It will contain XML elements inside the SAML token that contain user credentials that are in a coded way. So it enables that access that way. How do users navigate from org to org? I appreciate some of what we've been saying may sound like gibberish to you. We talk about IDP initiated and SP initiated. And that's really important for the identity and access management exam, because you will be given scenarios where you have to decide whether it's SP initiated or IDP initiated. And I find this is a great way to remember that. Yes, it blew our minds as well, Jolene, so don't worry. And actually it helps to cement the knowledge in our minds as well when we're describing it to you, because you know we both did the exam months ago, so we're having to revise this with you. So please bear with us. But the easiest way to think about this is if you're logged into Salesforce and you click the app launcher and you want to access an application which is hosted somewhere else. So like a lot like Workday, for example. Let's say you want to surface Workday through Salesforce, and you go to the app launcher. Salesforce is the identity provider. Salesforce holds the source of truth if it's been architected that way. Caveat. In this scenario, Salesforce holds the record that this is Susannah. Susannah clicks on app launcher and goes to open up Workday. Now, if Workday's set up as a connected app, Salesforce will actually append a message, send a message over to Workday to say, this is Susannah, it's okay for her to access Workday, and here is the certificate, so you can tell that it's from a trusted source, that it's okay.
And that message is the assertion.
Yes, that's the assertion, exactly. And the flow for that is really simple. It's, you know, knock, knock, who's there? Yes, it's okay. You've got an ID card and you can come in. We actually acted this all out, didn't we, at Dreamforce? It was a load of fun. We did. Short score was our resident ice cream in that particular scenario. Videos online. Anyway, SP initiated is slightly different. How many of you have received a link to a resource in Salesforce? So someone sends you a link to a dashboard in an email or in chat or in WhatsApp, and you click on it and you're confronted with the login page, right? All of you should be nodding at this one because it's happened to all of us. That's what we call a deep link. It's called a deep link because it's linking to a specific resource deep within the service provider, which is Salesforce. So when we click on that link, we're confronted with the login screen because an SP-initiated SAML flow has happened and said, hang on a minute, I don't know who this person is, and they want to look at my dashboard. So I've got to get them to log in. Or if I'm automating that login, someone else has got to tell me that it's okay for her to access that. Okay, so just remember that when you're looking at SAML, you're thinking about how you're automatically granting access to things without a user having to log in all the time. These are two apps that potentially are sharing information. Think about a bank. When you're given your own laptop, you're only allowed to log in from that laptop. You're only allowed to log in from that IP range. You click on the link and you can get in straight away when you're in the office. You take it home and you click on the link and it goes, but you can't log in because you can't see the login page, right? So what do? You have to go on the VPN, and then you go on the VPN and it suddenly works. So those are kind of scenarios where we talk about SP initiated, is because you've clicked on something and then it's come back to your browser and your browser's gone, I don't know who this is. You're going to have to log in, or you're going to have to wait until you can VPN in. Appreciate this is horrible stuff. So pictorially, because we love a good picture, we're all architects. What does that look like? If it's IDP initiated, here are all your apps. Here's Susannah's first spoke org, so she wants to get into her other org from her IDP org. So the fact that she's clicking on that initiates an IDP login request. It sends a response to the service provider, which is my first spoke. My first spoke receives that message that's routed through your browser, and it identifies the user and says yes or no. I found this user based on the federation ID. the what was it? It was
So for Buffy Slayer one.
yeah, the Slayer one. That's it. So in her IDP request, in the request from the SAML request from her IDP through the browser, it will contain the word Slayer 1. And then the browser will route that message through to My First Spoke. My First Spoke will look at that message and say, yeah, I know someone in my org that's called Slayer 1. Because I know that, because I can tell because you've attached the certificate, which is a big scrambled mess of letters and numbers, I can tell, because I've got a record of this certificate in My First Spoke keys and storage, I can tell that this is legit. It's come from a good place. So then that allows you to log in. Think about a nightclub. Have you got the stamp on your hand? Yes, you can come in. Are you on the guest list? Yes, you can come in. Okay, let's go to the SP-initiated. So SP-initiated, this has got some code on it. So, you know, I'm going to do my default thing and default to our lovely code lady, but I can explain most of it. So as I said not long ago, you click on the deep link that's in your email. And when the fact that you've clicked on that email is the request that your browser makes to access the resource that's in the MySpoke org, right? So then the MySpoke org will write back to the browser and go, I don't know who this is, or I do know who this is, depending on whether you've got a session or not, right? The IDP, which is the main IDP org that Susannah's got in the center of her hub and spoke model, will identify the user and actually check check the certificate, the certificate against the one they've got in store. The IDP will send a response to the service provider, so that's the spoke org, so that you can then access the help me, so that you can then access the dashboard.
Yes, you can access the protected resource. Yeah. So, and this code doesn't actually like line up to our scenario very well. This is from Salesforce docs, but what this is saying, so this is the auth request from, so I can see who it's from. It's from Google. It's a provider name, and this URL is what you would put in your, if you're using Salesforce as an IDP for Google, then you would put this in your identity provider setup. And actually, sorry, you would put this in your connected app setup for Google that you're going to create. And then it's telling me like, yes, Google is the issuer of this SAML assertion. And then I'm saying that just-in-time provisioning is allowed, I believe. So all of that, let's see, we have 3 minutes. So this is a bonus. Yes, moving on, this is a bonus. I do think that I wanted to touch very fast on this because I do think if we talk about authentication without how the heck do you get data from multi-org to org, that would be a miss. So this is just a taste of considerations around data. If you're sharing user logins, obviously if you have a hub and you have spokes, you need to think about, well, how does data flow? Do you want the hub org to push down information to all your service provider orgs, or do you want data to be generated in your spokes and your service providers and then pushed into a hub? So it depends on the requirements and all that good stuff, but these are two different models. I think the third model would be for diversification, just not sharing data. But these are the two models for that diversification. What are the other two? It's like coordination and something else.
Unification and
yeah.
You've got to think really carefully about your strategy here, and your customers will be like, well, you know, you need to tell me. So think carefully about what your customers' requirements are, and also hold those conversations about what is the master database, what is the source of truth for products, for customer data, users, for accounts, especially when you've got communities in there as well. Because the last thing, even if you've got different communities in different orgs, you've got to have your wits about you. So documentation is key. Build your diagrams, document document the flow of data, and document the flow of authentication between your different orgs as well, especially if you're a consultant and you're only in that org for 5 minutes compared to the poor admins that come after you and have to look after it.
Yeah, and especially when you think about, you were talking about, what's the hub, what's the spokes, and then also if you have integrations, do the integrations need to be created across all of these other orgs too? Another consideration. So for data, there are some typical ways you can keep data in sync or replicate data across orgs, just very quick hits. You can use an ETL tool like Informatica, or like you could use a MuleSoft to actually replicate the data. That comes with a lot of overhead and I would say heartache personally. Another option, if you don't want to replicate the data, is to use Salesforce Connect and what's called a cross-org adapter. So that allows you to sort of see the data without actually storing it in your Salesforce org. And with any of these, there are also identity and access considerations, right? You can't have a MuleSoft connect to Salesforce without making sure that it's you signed in to a particular, whatever API you're trying to connect to, or whatever ETL tool you need to connect to. There's always authentication and authorization that needs to happen with that, even if you're using ETL or Salesforce Connect.
Yeah, you can't get to data unless you're logged in some form. And a lot of the identity and access management considerations are around automatically logging in rather than having to have a user do it.
Exactly. So in conclusion, I heard there's an after party that's exciting. We'll just wrap it up here. In conclusion, there are many, many Salesforce identity tools that can help with your multi-org strategy. But with that, there are also many trade-offs and choices to be made depending on the customer's requirements or your requirements. And then finally, I do think that this is a great example of how all your domain knowledge, as you work through these exams, if you are doing that, how it all starts to come together. There's really no divide between integration and development lifecycle. All of these tools that you're learning are going to come together to help you build better solutions. So with that, I think we'll hold questions to the after party because we are over time. I did just want to highlight these next steps. So there's some resources. We'll be posting this to the blog, but if you want to learn more about what we talked about, there's tons of resources out there. And with that, thank you.
Thank you for coming, everybody. And we didn't do too bad. We only lost about 12 people, so we're great.
Pretty good, if you ask me.
Well done, Susannah, for powering on through. Thanks, everybody.